Greetings and bienvenue, MITZU. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
Some viewers may find the following video disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
The Lady in White, La Llorona, the Weeping Woman. I'm doing a short anthropology research paper on the White Lady, and I was wondering if /x/ has any ideas, personal stories, or myths about the strange apparition. Specifically, I'm focusing on the legend of La Llorona, which is locale-specific to the American Southwest and Mexico, along the banks of the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo. Bumping with another piece of information. In Honduras, the legend is known as La Sucia, or the Dirty One, presumably because she has the blood of her children on her hands, but that's pure speculation.
The story I know is, La Llorona was the mistress of a wealthy and powerful man in Mexico. She truly loved him, but he would not risk the scandal. She later became pregnant by him, and he still would not commit to her. At last, she gave birth and brought the child to her lover. He refused to acknowledge them and sent them away. Despondent, she went to the local river and drowned her child. She returned to her lover, stating that it could now be as it once was now that the child was gone. Disgusted and repulsed, he had her thrown out of town. Now with nothing, she paces the riverbanks searching for her lost child, crying and wailing. Some stories she snatches lost children or is responsible for local drownings. You always hear her at night along the river crying and searching.
I've heard that version too. Supposedly, the legend is based on the story of La Malinche, the mistress of Cortez, who bore 2 children for him but was ultimately rejected. She had helped him with the conquest of Mexico, and apparently regretted that to the end of her days. However, she did not commit self-termination, and her children lived, so it's a pretty thin connection.
In my town, the version held that she chopped up her children and put the pieces in the river, and she walks along rivers to look for all the pieces, though this seems to be conflated somewhat with the aforementioned Sucia legend. I'm a Jalisco friend, by the way.
Jalisco. Neat. Apparently my grandfather's from there. Chopped to pieces, huh? Sounds appropriately gruesome. However, I just looked it up, and I was wrong about La Sucia. She falls under the same tail type as La Llorona, but it's a subtype, as her story is actually about her being rejected at the altar. They have a similar appearance, however, so they're considered to be related a la folklore, though they're clearly not the same entity. The more you know, I guess.
Chopping the kids to pieces is feasibly one of the only ways her search could take her as far south as Jalisco, since major bifurcations only lead as far south as Durango, so the parts would have to take a crazy route to get there. I would think that almost everyone from a town in Mexico knows someone who swears they've heard crying coming from the river, though. I don't remember having heard a backstory for her life, or why she killed her kids. Insanity was implied. But I remember hearing something about her search being her punishment, and she has to collect all the pieces to avoid going to hell or so her kids could go to heaven. I may have heard both, but my memory isn't very trustworthy.
The versions I've read had that, plus a bit of background for it. Basically, she was a beautiful widow with 2 young children, who fell madly in love with a wandering charmer. The man wanted to romance her without having to take care of her children or stay with her. He didn't want to be the one to reject her, and wanted to get her to reject him instead, but he also didn't care how she felt about him because he was just going to head off somewhere else anyway. So when he was ready to leave, he told her that he couldn't be with a woman with children, and that she would have to kill her children to get her to stay. He said he'd meet her one last time before he left and headed off to do something or other in the meanwhile. While he was gone, the mentally unstable widow killed her children by dropping them into a river from a high cliff. The next day the man came back, feeling awful about what he'd said and planning to tell her the truth. She told him that she'd killed her children. He was completely horrified, rejected her, and ran off never to be seen again. The widow, fully realizing what she'd done, went completely mad. She desperately began searching for her now long-dead children in the river before killing herself by jumping over the edge of the cliff. She was condemned to wander the earth until she had collected every one of her children's bones. She's gotten desperate over the centuries, and if you run across her, she'll take your bones in a deluded hope she'll be able to use them to break the curse.
I'm from Chile, and our version of La Llorona, also known as Pucullén. It's about the specter of a woman dressed in white that appears every time someone dies. Of course, only people with paranormal abilities can see her. Also, in the Chilean version, this woman cries bitterly because her kids were murdered. According to this legend, The steps of La Llorona indicate the exact way a dead person should make to get to the other world. It is also said that she would appear to cry in the name of the relatives of the deceased, so that their pain would be less. But that's the nice part of the story, since some people ensure that this feminine figure has a dark side, as she is capable of stealing someone's child in order to lessen the pain from the murdering of her kids, and to get revenge for their deaths. According to other versions, La Llorona has the capacity to hypnotize men in order to have relations with them. Ultimately, another version of La Llorona indicates that she's a woman who visits the sick to announce death to them. This woman has slim figure, has black hair and dresses in black, some sort of death messenger.
The second one sounds like your traditional banshee. I'm really grateful for the insight, though, that she's also considered a death messenger. Gracias, amigo chileno. It's actually really good to hear about other incarnations of the legend in places other than the Rio Bravo, which implies it's very much a worldwide thing. I know England's got a white lady who's associated with wells and other water. It's very interesting, considering how far apart these cultures are, that they've all constructed very similar legends. Makes you wonder.
I'm from El Salvador. The version that goes on here is that La Llorona was a beautiful woman who had a few kids, I think 4, but they didn't have fathers because the men either walked out on her or died. Eventually, a new guy came along, rich and handsome, but he was just using her. She blatantly loved him with all her heart and would do whatever it took to stay with him. Here's where it gets confusing. Some say it was the devil, others say it was just a demon, and still some say he was just a man with a cruel heart. But he told the woman one night that the only way to be with him was if she didn't have kids. So she ran off and drowned all of her children in the river and ran back to find her man. But he disappeared and never came back. She suddenly realized what she had done, and in a fit of inconsolable rage and sorrow, she drowned herself too. Now her spirit walks about at night looking like a pretty girl but crying loudly, my children," until she spots anyone, not just kids but anyone, especially men and kids. Then she becomes that ugly drowned corpse and takes you to drown you too.
I grew up in Tequisquiapan, a smallish town in Querétaro, Mexico, since we lived next to a river. I always heard the La Llorona story growing up, mostly because they didn't want me and my cousins playing around down there. The story went that there was a woman who was happily married and had 3 children. They lived up in the mountains, so her husband would go down to the town to work. Somehow she found out that he was cheating on her. Overcome with grief and wanting to get revenge, she took her children to the river that was just down the mountain and drowned them, and then drowned herself. Because of the fast pace of the river, the children's heads were carried off with the current. So before she is sent to hell, God orders her that she must return to the living world to find the heads of her children, or they will never leave purgatory. Her spirit is brought back to the living world, and she wanders rivers and running water looking for her children's heads, crying to herself, mis hijos, ay, mis hijos. If you find yourself at the riverside and you hear her, you must get away, or she will kill you and try to substitute your head for one of her children. When I moved to Texas, it was sort of the same story, though I've heard a lot of different versions, like she was just some woman who went crazy and killed her kids. That she was a bride who drowned herself after her fiancé was found dead. That she was a horrible mutant. Do they call this the Donkey Lady, and seem to relate it as being the same as La Llorona depending who you ask.
Yeah, there are many stories about La Llorona. The main things are river, her children. She cries, ay mis hijos. Whenever you hear ay mis hijos in Mexico, you know they are talking about La Llorona.
An old Aztec legend starts with the story of a woman with her family. There are lots of ways on how the story goes, but the most popular go with her losing it and murdering her children. She then took their bodies and dumped on the local river. She then repented and yearned for her dead kids, running towards the river searching for them but with no avail. Legend goes that she forever roams every river in Mexico, yearning for her kids and screaming. This is the story of La Llorona. Some relate her story with Coatlicue, the mother goddess of the Aztecs and other Mesoamerican groups. When she suddenly became pregnant by some mysterious force, her other children were jealous of her and planned to murder the infant unborn god. The story goes with Coatlicue hiding from her other holy offspring in Coatepec, the Serpent Hill, which is related with water and codexes, and was surrounded. At the worst moment, Coatlicue gave birth to Huitzilopochtli, patron god of the Aztecs. Huitzilopochtli was already born a warrior and slaughtered his brothers and sisters in what had to be the most epic metal song ever written. Some people say that Coatlicue is the original Llorona, who forever yearns from her fallen children even though they conspired against her. Other versions of the story go as the Llorona, as the spirit of the Aztec people who were slaughtered, plagued and humiliated by the conquering and colonizing Spaniards. There are lots of places where La Llorona has been seen, and almost everywhere where there are rivers. Lots of people claim to have heard her screaming for her lost children.
My mom is a first-generation American. Her parents moved from Chihuahua, Mexico to El Paso, Texas before she was born. The supernatural was very prevalent in both sides of her family. My grandfather claims that we are descended from the Apache warlord Victorio, and that the spirit of Victorio appeared to him and his brothers when he was a young man. My mom had many experiences with ghosts and spirits, but she said that none was more terrifying than her experience with La Llorona. Her family lived in a decent-sized house on the banks of a canal on the south side of El Paso. At the time, the family had 3 dogs. My mom describes all of them as the toughest dogs on the block. One night in the dead of winter, my grandfather was telling my mom one of his many great stories, when there was a loud commotion in the front yard where the dogs were. The dogs were barking to wake the dead. My mom and her dad went outside into the front to see what was going on. They were joined by my grandmother. They had not noticed this before, but a fog was slowly creeping around the street. The air was chill, but different from the cold of winter. The cold went down to the very bone. The 3 dogs were barking towards the fog, or more accurately toward the canal that was by the house. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream pierced the night air. My mom described it as the most terrifying cry she has heard in her entire life. She says that it lasted for a full minute before finally dissipating. When the scream left, the fog lifted and the dogs returned to the way they were before. My mom asked her dad what the scream was, but all he said was, La Llorona, and told her to go to bed. Naturally, she couldn't sleep and instead listened to her parents debate over whether or not to call the cops and report a murder or something. In the morning, when it was light out, my grandfather went down to the canal but unsurprisingly found nothing. When he came back, he told my mom the legend of the woman who drowned her own children and is now fated to cry out for them on the banks of the river where she killed them. And to this day, my mom is convinced that she heard La Llorona on that night so many years ago. Another close associate of mine who has had a close encounter with La Llorona is my former karate instructor and confirmation class teacher. He is Irish and a devout Catholic, but firmly believes in the existence of ghosts and the paranormal. When he was a teenager, he lived in New Mexico, close to the borders with Texas and Mexico. Like any good teenager looking for a rush, he liked to ride around with his brothers after dark and watch for ghosts in the old graveyards. One night, he and his brothers managed to convince a couple of girls they were sweet on to come along. They were sitting in their car in the middle of the desert when a deep fog started setting in. They were unsettled and decided to leave, but the car wouldn't start. Suddenly, he says that everything went completely and utterly pitch black, like someone had thrown a tarp over the car. My friend flipped, but his brothers were frozen in their seats, unable to move a muscle. He yelled, but they still didn't move. He reached over and managed to finally start the car. He was 15 and didn't even have a license, but he drove out of there like a bat out of hell. When his heart finally stopped racing, he stopped the car. He turned to his brother and asked him what the hell happened back there. His brother, with his face still white, asked him incredulously, "Jim, did you not see her?" He shook his head no and asked his brother what he was talking about. His brother told him that when everything had gone black, a strange translucent white woman appeared outside of the car. She looked like a wicked witch. She reached her hand into the car, through the closed window for Jim's neck, but stopped and drew back when she touched it. She then disappeared, and that was when the car started.
This strange situation happened to me in 1980 in Chile. I was living then with my father and his family, my stepmother and her children, and my 2 younger sisters. I was then 13, and we were living in a place in Viña del Mar, Chile, called Chorrillo Alto, and it was a poor sector of the city. My father bought a place at Chorrillo Alto and made a rustic house there with very thin walls. The house could have been better built, but he never cared about such things. Having food and a shelter was enough for him. The house was built on a hill. There was no running water, and we had several neighbors living around us in the same conditions. We were 5 girls sleeping in a big room, and on the other side of my wall there was a little track used by everybody who lived near us to come to a bigger road nearby. One night, I woken up by a sound which at first I didn't recognize. Suddenly I was completely awake and could hear clearly a woman crying in the saddest way one could imagine. At first I thought, sure, it must be a poor woman married to a drunken husband and probably being beaten up by him. There were such families around with alcoholic men who could make exhibition of themselves from time to time. The woman cried a short minute, and suddenly her cry started to get very strange. The vocals started to become too long. It didn't sound like anything I'd heard until now in my life. First a normal crying that continued like, oh my God. I promise you people that all the hair of my body was standing up. It was the most horrifying wail I have ever heard, and I don't think I will never hear again. It was clearly not from this world anyway. I was petrified and didn't dare to go and take a look, so I didn't move an inch and I was cold and sweating, completely frightened. I never told anybody of this night. The years passed and we moved to live in this country we are living in now. One day in 2001, I was 34 then, my youngest sister came to my house for supper, and she told me something that proved that I indeed heard a ghost that night. She told me that one night in the same house, she was then 7 years old, she awoke in the middle of the night because she heard a woman crying. She felt curious and looked through the window and saw a woman in our backyard. From the distance, she seemed to be walking fast, but when my sister looked at her feet, she was floating like 50 centimeters above the ground. She never saw her face, but the woman had black long hair and a floating gown. While my sister was looking at her, she could hear swings moving. Suddenly, she forgot about the woman and became very happy and wanted to go out to see the swings. She was halfway out of the house in the middle of the night when she remembered that there were no swings where we lived. She stopped and turned inside the house, and the sound of swings stopped at once too. I don't know what it was. Who was that woman? I just remember that one day before this happened to me, I was walking with some friends up a hill above the one we lived on, and I saw a white cross, the kind of cross that Chileans put on haunted places to keep the spirits and the devil away from the place. Perhaps people who lived there before knew about the haunting and tried to warn others by leaving the cross there, or perhaps they tried to make a spiritual barricade to keep the spirits away. Who knows?
In 1995, my wife, my 2 kids and I were invited by some friends to spend a 3-day weekend one winter in Payson, Arizona in an old rustic cabin. The cabin was a few miles off the main highway and deep in a beautiful pine forest. It was a beautiful cabin. It had a moose head over the fireplace, a bear head on another wall and a deer head trophy on another wall, and several other wildlife heads spread throughout the cabin. The cabin had a lot of Indian blankets covering the walls and furniture and a southwestern motif throughout the cabin. I thought they decorated it, but they said no. The inside was built with pine logs from the walls to the pitched ceiling and had a large living room, small kitchen, 1 master bedroom, and a room to the back with bunks for kids, and a loft with a drop-down ladder where you had to climb up into the loft. They invited another couple to their cabin, and unfortunately, the couple had dibs to the kids' room because they got there before us. Our kids would sleep on the couch and the floor in the living room under the fireplace. My wife and I would sleep in the loft. The loft was a very small part of the cabin. It was a small crawl space just underneath the pitch of the roof in one corner on top of the cabin. It had 2 full-sized thin mattresses on 2 very cheap spring metal fold-up metal beds. We all played Trivial Pursuit and partied that night until 2 in the morning. When we went to bed, buzzed, my wife and I were handed blankets and pillows and we climbed the ladder into the loft. The minute my wife and I went into the loft, I felt an energy. It was not a bad energy. It was just a sense that something was different. The loft's ceiling's wood was completely covered with cobwebs. The lady that owned the place hollered up, "I know it's dark up there, but if you want, you can light a candle." I said, "Yeah, give me a candle." My wife and I slept on one of the fold-out beds in the small corner of the loft with another empty bed shoved in the corner and a candle lit next to our bed on the floor. I tried to read a book. As I began reading my book and tried to go to sleep, I became concerned that my candle might catch the cobwebs on fire, and I put the candle out and went to sleep. During the night as I slept, I kept hearing a sigh and whimpering. At first I thought it was my wife having a bad dream, and I nudged her, and went back to sleep. But as the night went on, I kept hearing this very sad, quiet whimpering. I kept nudging my wife, and she would shove my hand away. As I tried going back to sleep over and over again through this whimpering, I finally realized the whimpering was not coming from my wife, but from the bed in the corner and next to our bed. It was a very sad, quiet whimper and also once in a while a sad sigh. It was the sad sigh of a woman. All night long as I tried to sleep, and in my dreams, I kept hearing this very sad whimpering and sighing. Sometimes, my wife would shake me awake and say, "Knock it off." Many times during the night as I slept, I would perk up to a sigh from the bed. I never heard a sheet ruffle or a creak from the bed, but all night, I heard a sigh and so many times a whimper. I don't know how long it took, but I finally fell asleep, when my wife suddenly woke me and said, "It's time to get up." She nudged me a few times and said, "Get up." I looked out the window at the top of our loft and the light out of our small window was so incredibly bright that I thought the sun had come up. The only difference was that it was an extremely bright glowing white light instead of a nice golden yellow beautiful morning sun that one would expect from the early morning sun. When I looked at my wife, she was sound asleep. The next morning, I asked my wife about her waking me up, and she said, "Did you see that? I thought it was morning. Then it went away. It was not morning. It was the middle of the night, and I went back to sleep." Then she asked me, "So you saw it too?" I said, "Yeah. I thought it was morning." Later, when the other people that invited us there while we were having coffee asked how our night went, my wife told her about our weird light experience, and how I kept hearing crying and whimpering all night and couldn't sleep. My wife said she heard the sighing too. Then the lady who bought the cabin told us a story about a young Indian girl named White Dove. That fell in love with this white man, and he built this cabin for her, but it had to be a secret because he was married and could not marry her, but he built this cabin so they could be lovers. Naturally, she wanted more. But he could not give more. He was married. She committed self-terminated in this cabin he built for her when he went away to his real family. Sounds like a typical cliché story. But our experience was not a cliché.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.
There's also a Rumble archive as a backup.